Thank you, sir. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually the guy on the right, David Schatzman. I hope you guys have had a wonderful DC Summit session so far. I know for many of you, you've been here since Monday morning, maybe doing one of your vertical groups or maybe the GovCloud Cab. Of course, yesterday was a really exciting day, and then here we are in day 3. So I appreciate your sticking around for the afternoon. Resiliency is really important to me. I've actually spent a lot of my career working with really high-end workloads and really helping customers understand what their resiliency needs are and helping them to work toward their goals. I actually started my career in the 90s working for a hardware OEM and did that for many years until after the dot-com boom. Then I got into the defense and aerospace business. I had the opportunity to serve the Air Force in a whole bunch of different capacities as a contractor. And then back into the OEM world, hardware OEM world, working for a large OEM hardware manufacturer. And then AWS was the place I got really passionate about as I realized the great value of a cloud service provider to the types of workloads that we do here with GovCloud. And what's really exciting to me is that only 5% of workloads have moved from the standard data centers over into a cloud service provider. So we have a wonderful opportunity right now to start building resilient architectures at the ground so that as we grow over time and your workload requirements grow and evolve, we have the right infrastructure in place. Well, maybe before we get going here, could I ask you just 2 quick questions? The first one I had for you is, how many customers here already have workloads in GovCloud, just so we can kind of tailor our... Okay, so you guys are pretty savvy. And then for the balance, do you have plans to move a workload or to do anything with GovCloud in the next, say, year or so? Okay, so we have a really seasoned group of people here, which is wonderful. So we'll tailor the conversation to that. So what we want to accomplish today, this is going to be my part here, just a general discussion about the regulated marketplace, touch on resiliency a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it over to my partner here, Sean, who will introduce himself in a second, and he's going to talk about, why would you want to do a multi-region workload? What would the reasons be that would drive you toward that versus a single region? How do you manage and set up disaster recovery? How do you ensure business continuity? And then, what are the different types of multi-region strategies that AWS has available to you to enable your resiliency architecture? So before we get too much farther down the road here, I went to start building with Sean to build this presentation, and I realized that resiliency means many different things to many different people. A really good friend of mine is a CISO for a federal agency, has been for a number of years, and I was out with him a couple weeks ago, and I said to him, his name is Greg, I said, hey, what does resiliency mean to you? Oh, well, that's how quickly I can recover from a cyber incident. I'm like, okay, that makes good sense. And then another friend of mine is a CIO, also in the regulated industries. And I says, what is a CIO, what does that resiliency mean to a CIO? And he said, well, to me, that means uptime. That means, are my systems up, are my systems down? Am I meeting my SLAs, right? The real data-driven approaches. A CFO, a neighbor of mine, not a GovCloud customer, but just a CFO, said to me, well, to me, resilience is, well, how do I bill my money? Is my money coming in? Am I able to do my business? So, different spin on it. Now, for us as users, right, myself as a user through a whole bunch of different avenues, resiliency to me means a couple of things, and I learned them through experience last week. As an example, I went to register my car, for license plates, and the system was down, right? And so I was like, whatever, I'll just do this next week, right? So I went and logged in. Of course, the next week it worked. So my resiliency threshold was extremely low in that workload. In contrast, during the pandemic, I have a daughter that was schooling at home. When the online learning system didn't work, that was a high value asset, right? And it created a lot of consternation. So having said all that, if I could just draw your attention over to the screen here, this is what AWS's definition of resiliency is. And I'm going to read it to you if you wouldn't mind. Resiliency is the ability of a system to respond, adapt, eventually overcome from unexpected conditions. Now, what's an unexpected condition, right? That sounds very nebulous, and I acknowledge that, and that's Sean is going to talk a lot about that as we go through this content. So in the course of the discussion, mentioned, there's 3 pillars of resiliency. The first one I'm going to touch on infrastructure, and the second 2 architecture and best practices Sean is going to dive into. But for me, and if you don't mind me reading this again here, AWS GovCloud US, it's a regulated cloud platform. When we say regulated, we mean FedRAMP High, we mean DoD SRG IL5, we mean ITAR and CGIS and so forth. But anyway, designed to enable compliance with the flexibility to balance, and that's a really key word here, I underlined it for us, to balance resiliency with cost, right? Because if you have an endless pile of money, you can have a highly resilient architecture, but of course being good stewards of our agencies or our money, we want to be smart and we want to balance that. So for me, we want to build resilient architectures that minimize downtime, but provide the appropriate amount of performance and scalability that you need to be able to accomplish your mission. So these are some considerations, and I could spend an hour talking about these, but I don't. But I will say to you that, to me, resiliency is a critical design pillar, and it's important because it affects the experience of your customers, whether they be taxpayers or airmen or whoever they may be, and also, to me, if you have a highly resilient architecture, you can move these really high-value assets, mission-critical crown jewels of your agency or your partner network, over to GovCloud with the confidence that the platform has the ability to provide you with the business resiliency that you need to keep your workload going. I would also say, yeah, it's complex, right? If it was easy, anyone can do it, and you'll learn that through talking to Sean. But one thing I can say throughout my years of experience in doing this is that if you think through resiliency from the ground up, it's an easy process. But if you don't, and you get your workload into production, and then you start having SLA breaches and slow performance and so on and so forth, it's very hard to go back into a production workload and to re-engineer it for the level of resiliency that you really need to realize. So I would say to you, as we go forward in this presentation, and of course as you work on your adoption plans and your migration plans, really do think about resiliency as just as important as cost and just as important as scalability. I do believe they're very, very, very intertwined. And also, I won't lie to you. Resiliency can be expensive, right? Think about this: if you have a workload running in a single availability zone in a highly utilized instance, you're not going to be spending a lot of money comparatively if you look at one that's, say, spread across 3 availability zones, maybe 3 availability zones in 2 regions. Well, I won't lie to you, it's going to cost more money, right? Because you're consuming more infrastructure. So it's really important that you think about the balance, right, as I said before, between cost and resiliency. And then the final thought I would leave you is that, resiliency, disaster recovery, business continuity, all these things we're going to talk about today, they're not the same in an on-prem environment. There's a story I could tell you if you would stay afterward. I can tell you in the hallway, but some really interesting stories about how resiliency is accomplished in an on-premise environment, and then, conversely, how it is accomplished using a cloud service provider and the best practices for that. And there's a lot of good things that we can do for you to make sure that you're doing it the most efficient and cost-effective approach, using the most efficient and cost-effective approach. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the GovCloud infrastructure. Now you may be familiar with this slide. It comes in a lot of our kind of introductory packages, and it's also available on our website. But the points here that I wanted to make, there's actually 2 or 3. One is that if you're thinking about geographic resiliency, what would happen if just a terrible force majeure type event happened on the West Coast? Do you need that durability and resiliency to be able to maintain your business operation using the other region, in this case is in the eastern region. So take away from this slide that we can offer you that geographic separation, right? It's public knowledge, of course, that GovCloud West is in Oregon, and of course GovCloud East is in Ohio. A little tidbit of knowledge, the West GovCloud region just celebrated its 10th anniversary, and of course GovCloud East has been around since 2018. So just think about bicoastal infrastructure, and between the 2 regions, there's 6 availability zones, 3, of course, per region. All right, so this is a view of our dual region architecture. We have here GovCloud West and GovCloud East, and then of course a typical user. Now, what we'd like to suggest to you here is that you have the ability to use a dual region architecture if your resiliency requirements drive you toward that. So we're offering you the flexibility, to host dual region deployments for mission critical high value assets. So with that, can I ask everyone a quick question? Does anyone running a dual region workload right now? It's okay to say no. Okay, we got what, one or two? Yeah, two. That's wonderful. And that's what we would expect because the resiliency of one of our regions with 3 availability zones is very strong. And that, of course, is what many of our customers do. So, I would just suggest to you here that if you are running in 3 availability zones in one region and you do start to think about improving your resiliency, looking toward a dual region architecture may make sense to you. Of course, there's additional engineering and cost associated with that. So as I said before, we really need to balance and tailor that, and that's what Sean and I are here to help you do. So now let's kind of dive down a little bit deeper here. So now we're talking about one region, whether it be the western or the eastern region, right? And thinking about really what I think a lot of you are doing. You have the ability to put your workload in one availability zone, right? And we know that one availability zone is a cluster of data centers, not just one. And we know that they offer redundant power. We know that they offer redundant cooling. We know that it's very important for us to make sure that they're 60 miles or greater separated between availability zones and also in different floodplains with different power providers. The list of resiliency features that these availability zones as themselves is very strong. And I would also say to you that they are partitioned, from the AWS broader network. That of course is due to compliance requirements. And of course they're also partitioned into U.S. citizens only operations. So no non-U.S. citizen would ever find their way into one of the GovCloud availability zone data centers. So that's another great feature of that. Then lastly, I would just say that each availability zone is isolated. So if there's a problem in one region, whether it be with the workload or the availability zone itself, we do have that isolation to offer you between the different availability zones to help, again, drive resiliency. All right, these are some distinguishing features. These don't directly relate to resiliency, but there's some synergies that I just wanted to point out to you. And these are the fundamental reasons why many of you may actually be utilizing GovCloud in lieu of maybe one of our commercial regions, right? It's compliance. All of our regions, of course, are secure. Security is job zero, the most important job for us. But I would just make a couple of comments here. Of course, FedRAMP High is one of the foundational compliance programs that we support, and of course DoD SRG impact levels 4 and 5 are also very highly sought after. Of course Ohio and Oregon are on U.S. soil, right? So we got that covered, as I said before, managed by U.S. citizens. And I would also just say, looking at what the definition of a NIST community cloud, this is one that I think a lot of people tend to overlook, and it does drive resilience. And NIST talks about the concept of a public cloud, and an example of public cloud would be our commercial regions like U.S. West, U.S. East, Northern California, Northern Virginia. But there's also a NIST private cloud, and that might be some on-premise hardware you may have with VMC running on it or something like that. And then there's a community cloud, and that's what GovCloud is. GovCloud is a community cloud for U.S. federal and state and local government workloads that have the ability to have requirements and controlled and classified information. Partners use it, end users use it, integrators use it. It's a broad base of customers. So I wanted to say one other thing to you before I turn the microphone over, and this is something that I've become really interested in the last couple of years as we talk about climate change. And a customer said to me, this was about 2 months ago, it was on a Zoom call, and they said, I've been planning for resiliency, but at the same time, I have these carbon retirement requirements, right? In other words, the contract had requirements in it to reduce carbon emissions. So when I'm planning my resiliency, I'm driving costs, sure, but I'm also, having a negative impact on the environment. And I thought about that for a while because that really challenged me to think, and it drove me to our sustainability group. And what I learned there, a couple of slides to talk about a long program, is that our company, our AWS, encourages people, just like they do with costs, is to balance their sustainability with their resiliency needs, right? And make sure that you're being sensible while creating your resilient architecture. But the key point here is that when you compare to a typical data center, we are 3.6 times more energy efficient, and we have an 88% lower carbon footprint. I'm going to read you something here for a second. 61% of the 88% is due to more efficient server utilization, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second in the context of sustainability. I know you know what that means. 11% just because we have green data centers, and 17% reduced energy consumption. So you'll be able to, by using GovCloud or any of our US regions, you'll be able to minimize your carbon footprint while at the same time driving your resiliency. And as a matter of fact, sustainability is now one of the pillars of our well architecture review, which, by the way, is available in the GovCloud console right now. So these are a couple of quick things that you can do as far as sustainability. You can use a Graviton processor. It has the best price performance of any instance type that we have available in our fleet for GovCloud, and for that matter for the commercial regions. But it's also more power efficient, another benefit of it. Use serverless, services like Lambda when possible, just a burst of energy, right, to do the service. You turn it off when you don't use it, instance schedule, and of course Cost Explorer to make sure you're right sizing the workloads. As a quick example, before I turn the mic over to my colleague here, there's an entire 1-hour presentation on this, and if you're interested, I'd be happy to give it to you. But best practices in resiliency and sustainability in a 3AZ configuration, 66% in 3 availability zones, so that when one of them becomes unavailable, you're at 100%, right? And you're maximizing utilization while, at the same time making sure that you have the capacity necessary to manage your workload during an event. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I'm going to turn the microphone over to my colleague here, and he's going to take us in a deep dive into why you may want to use multi-region architecture in lieu of, say, a 1AZ or a 3AZ single region architecture.
Thanks, David.
You're welcome.
So hello, everyone. I am Sean Asfeld. I am a specialist solutions architect with our GovCloud and Government Regions team. And so, David is one of our business development managers, and so I support them. I support your sales teams, your solutions architects, right, for your account teams. And so we are here to help. And today we're going to talk about, why do you need a multi-region architecture? Well, as our CTO, Werner Vogel, says, everything fails all the time. And so, for this reason alone, we should build for resilient architectures, right? We need to be able to support failures, recovery, right? Whether that's manual or automatic recovery, active-active type of scenarios, backup disaster recovery. And so I'm going to take you through a little scenario, right? So in this scenario, we've got services and applications running in 2 different regions, right? And we've got users across the US. And the next thing you know, oh no, service 1 goes down. Well, that's okay, because that service, that's not mission critical. It's okay, service that 1 goes down. And now, oh no, service 2 went down. Well, that one was semi-critical, but you know what? I think we're having a larger scale event. Maybe we need to fail over, right? And so having that availability in another region, you're able to redirect your traffic and stay up, right? So just a little scenario for you. So, why else might you want to do disaster recovery, business continuity reasons, right? Maybe you have regulatory compliance. Maybe you need to have data a meaningful distance away from your primary workload, right? Maybe you also have a geographically distributed user base, right? So maybe you've got users on each end of the coast and they're using our simple storage service, or they're using some other web application, something that's, latency sensitive, right? So you want to improve latency by distributing your workload across different regions, so that way your users have improved performance. And then last, right, extreme reliability. Some applications are mission critical. They can't go down, or they should not go down. And if they do go down, what happens? If you're looking at this from a business perspective, right, are we losing money by not being operating? Or if you're looking at, some other mission critical where it's NASA or some other agency and maybe there's astronauts in space and they have to get home, right? So some of those things cannot go down, and you need extreme reliability. So one thing to note, though, is that a multi-region architecture does not necessarily equal a multi-region active-active, right? Multi-region architecture is an architecture that spans multiple regions, but active-active is only when you have two fully active stacks across those regions, right? So you could have your base infrastructure deployed to two regions and have different applications in those regions, right? And now that's a multi-region architecture. But unless you're running two discrete workloads in both of those regions, right, that's when you would be active-active. Also, high availability is not disaster recovery, right? So, availability and disaster recovery, they're very similar, right? But high availability is having everything available in multiple regions, whereas disaster recovery is being able to fail that workload over to another region, right? Whether that's a pilot light or a warm standby, right? But that data needs to be available in another region. So let's talk about disaster recovery a little bit, right? So as you see on here, right, you've got your base workload. You've done well. You've started off with a highly available architecture. But for recovery reasons, right, data in S3, it needs to replicate over to another region. You need to have that data available for a failover scenario. If you're running an Aurora database, right, maybe you're replicating a read replica to that other region, that data is available if needed. Now, there's no other infrastructure built over here, right? Just data. It's just backup. If you have Amazon machine images, AMIs, you can copy those over to another region and have them backed up there as well. All right, so business continuity, right? All tying together here. So your recovery point objective, or RPO, really, how much data can you afford to recreate or lose, right? How far back can you go? Do I have a snapshot, and that snapshot is from a day ago, and there's data on that drive, so now my recovery point is 24 hours? Or do I have 15-minute increment snapshots, and now my recovery point is 15 minutes? And on the other side of that, right, you have your RTO, or your recovery time objective. And so how quickly can you recover? How quickly must you recover? What is the cost of downtime? We talked about those business disasters, right? Something happens, my sales site's not up, I can't make sales. How much money am I losing every minute, hour, day, however long it takes you to recover? Now, one thing to note here is that not every workload will have the same, RPO or RTO time, right? So take a look at each workload individually and see what its RPO and RTO is, right? If it doesn't have a recovery objective or a recovery time objective already prescribed, then do some analysis, work with those teams, and see what that should be. And so that kind of brings up the spectrum here, right? So for a disaster event based on disruption or loss of one physical data center for a well-architected, highly available workload, you may only require a backup and restore strategy. If your definition of a disaster goes beyond the disruption or loss of a physical data center to that of an entire region, or if you are subject to regulatory requirements that require it, then you should consider pilot light, go back one, pilot light, warm standby, or potentially even multi-site active-active. So let's talk a little bit more about backup and restore, right? So whereas before we were just doing backup, right, now we're talking a little bit more about restore. So not only do we have, wrong button, not only do I have our S3 bucket and some of our servers, right, we're gonna take our AMIs and we're gonna copy those snapshots over our simple storage service. We're gonna be replicating that to another region. And then our infrastructure is code, right? The things that we use to deploy our infrastructure or our applications, right? We also need to make sure that that infrastructure as code is moved over. So now we're moving along, and now we're going to Pilot Light. Pilot Light is similar, right? The data will be replicated and it will be there. There will be minimal amounts of infrastructure in place, but nothing will be actively running, right? So as you can see, everything's grayed out. You've got your servers are built, your availability zone, your networking is there, your data is actively being replicated over, but it's not running, right? You're not consuming resources other than your storage, and it's just kind of there sitting and waiting. And then we progress and we're into warm standby. Just like Pilot Light, data is being replicated, your infrastructure is built out, but at this point, some things are running, right? But it's not at production scale. You still have to scale up. You still have to have scalable applications, whether those are using our EC2 scaling, or maybe you have servers that are just off and ready to take the load, right? But as you progress, right, from one side to the other, you have more and more infrastructure in place, more and more infrastructure running. And then lastly, now you have an active scenario. So now here, your workload is running on both sides, your data is being replicated on both sides, you have your full infrastructure in place, you've got a log seam, your databases, your app, everything's going, and both sides are running and taking load. All right, so we talked a little bit about workloads, disaster recovery, business continuity, right? And so, you know, operating in GovCloud, a lot of people have compliance requirements, and you know, service availability is different in GovCloud than it will be in some of our commercial regions. And so we have our compliant framework for federal and DoD workloads, which is kind of all of our best practices wrapped up into CloudFormation templates. So it's an automated infrastructure as code solution that helps customers rapidly deploy a multi-account AWS GovCloud US environment designed to be secure and support compliance. It includes implementation guide, architecture diagrams, AWS CloudFormation templates, and security controls and practices documentation. And customers are able to choose a deployment model to suit their particular compliance requirement, whether that's IL4, IL5 DoD, CMMC. It's all available on our website. There's implementation guides, there's explanations. If you have more questions, need a deeper dive, you know, reach out to your account teams. We'd be more than happy to talk to you about implementing these. And here's an eye chart for you. This is the base infrastructure of the compliant framework. And don't worry, I will break this down. I won't make you suffer through this, this picture alone. But just a few things to note, right? There's a transit account. So as you see, everything flows into this transit account, and that's where your next-gen firewall, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention services would be. If you have a direct connect, maybe going back to CAP connection, all potential things that you can run in this type of setup. All right, so let's talk about the central account, right? So this is your AWS organization's root. So the central account is the location of the AWS code commit repository for all infrastructure as code artifacts that are utilized in this solution. An automated CI/CD pipeline utilizing Code Pipeline is used to deploy the solution from source repositories hosted in Code Commit. The central account is the AWS organization's root account in AWS GovCloud US, and it is the parent container for all AWS GovCloud accounts in this architecture. As the organization root, central account is enabled to aggregate compliance findings from GuardDuty, AWS Config, and AWS Security Hub from all of the child accounts. The central account contains the AWS Service Catalog portfolio for all of the other accounts, including the mission application accounts, which we'll get into in a little bit. So this enables a centralized strategy for IT governance, allowing mission application owners to deploy approved products and services into tenant workload accounts. Now, when we say approved, we mean applications, software that your team has approved for deployment into those mission applications, not approved from a compliance standpoint. So flowing out of that core organizational unit, along with its security control policies, we have the management services account. So this is where you'll find things like AWS Directory Service, Managed AD, or your own Active Directory, Active Directory Federated Services, your vulnerability scanning, your endpoint protection, antivirus, those kinds of things. So that management services account has the ability to reach out and touch to the mission application accounts and all of the other accounts, right? So it's really there for those managed services or those services that need to be talking to all of the other accounts. Also flowing out of that core organizational unit is your logging account. So this provides a centralized, immutable location for various types of log generated across the environment. So that could be primarily aggregated into an S3 bucket, but it could be coming from CloudTrail, AWS Config, Amazon CloudWatch, Amazon Virtual Private Cloud or VPC flow logs, the operating system, and your application logs. File integrity is enabled for all of the log files into a single. File integrity is enabled for all log files, creating SHA-256 hashes for every delivered log file. By placing all of the logs into a single account, you can utilize the principle of least privilege to delegate discrete permissions for accessing data within this account. So this is separate from other AWS accounts, and so with that you're able to get integrity and fidelity, right? So if you've got a security team and they don't need access to the rest of your environment, you could give them sole access to your immutable logs so that they could do their analysis or pull them for an audit or whatever they need to do with them. So up next, we talked about that a little earlier, was the transit account. So this is your transit VPC model, right? So this is ingress traffic, egress traffic. All accounts talk back to the transit gateway that's hosted, right? And so if you need to go to the internet or to the CAP or wherever you need to go, you can go through your next-gen firewall. If it's the management services account, it can go to the transit gateway and it'll have a route that's allowed to go to like the mission application. You can attach your VPN connection to your transit account, so that way you can route in and out off an on-prem. You can have a direct connect and a VPN, right? You can use your VPN connection as your backup connection in case direct connect goes down. So transit account, really, transit VPC, a transitive area for ingress and egress traffic. All right, so tying it all together, right? So everything flows out of that core organizational unit. You've got your SCPs. You would have a separate organizational unit set up for your application accounts, right? You could have different SCPs, whether that's for production accounts, dev accounts, testing, right? You could have different control policies for different accounts. It's all run within an organization, so you can give developers and users different permissions across the different accounts, right? So, all right. So now we're moving into, I've taken out the logging account and the central account, right? Because they're there, but not as important, especially when you have so much to get on the screen, right? So over here, you've got your transit account, right? You've got your firewalls, your intrusion detection. You also have administrative remote access down here, right? So whether you have a Bastion host or something running, you could potentially do that. We also have Systems Manager available. You could delegate access to your administrators through the console to access their servers as well. Your management services account, right? Your Active Directory, your single sign-on, endpoint protection, all of that's running along with our Systems Manager, right? For representation for this, right, we're running in 2 availability zones, but there are 3 available if you can pull off 3 firewalls in your design. So let's look a little bit over here. So right, so we've got our workload 1, right? We've got web servers, they're in an auto-scaling group. You've got your app servers, they're in an auto-scaling group, and then you've got your databases, right? In discrete subnets, everything is highly available, right? And so highly available is great, and you should always start with a highly available architecture, but sometimes you need a second region, right? And so for that, right, Pilot Light would make a great scenario. If you had a business critical workload that needed to get up semi-quickly, right? Pilot Light is really one of your best scenarios. Your data is being replicated, right? So your S3 bucket is running or being replicated over here. Your database, you have at least one read replica running over here. You'd have your AMIs copied over. All right, your base infrastructure is there and ready to go, along with your next-gen firewall, right? This stuff is built out but not running. Active Directory for disaster recovery for Pilot Light would need to be running, right? You need that directory needs to be synced over so that way user passwords, DNS, whatever you're using it for, right? That data needs to be there as well, so that would potentially be running. Would you have logging in this situation? Maybe, maybe not, right? If you're running very minimal, you might be able to just take these logs and shoot them back over to the other region so that you don't have to have additional infrastructure, right? But those are caveats, those are things that you can change. So everything's built out in availability zone A, and then you could scale to availability zone B if needed across all of these. And then you get warm standby. So things are running, but it's not at production scale, right? Your data, again, your data is being replicated, your AMIs are there, but in this instance, right, still you're running maybe in one availability zone, right? So you'll have your firewall running, you'll have your intrusion detection, your packet capture services, your endpoint protection, your Active Directory, your SSO, everything is running just at non-production scale. Ready to go, ready to scale up if needed. And you're also not taking load in a warm standby scenario. It's really just there to know that it's ready to go in a large scale event, right? And there are a few things you have to think about when you decide about whether you're going to fail over a workload to that disaster region, right? How quickly can I bring that workload up, right? How critical is that workload? How long do we think the other region is going to be down? What is the cost of failing that workload over, spinning that up, and then failing back, right? So these are things you have to think about as you prioritize workloads and you map it, right? And not every workload needs the same type of backup scenario, right? But your most critical workload, if it needs warm standby, you still have to run some of your warm standby, right? But then you might have other services that you just backing up the data and you'll rebuild it because it's not mission critical. If the other region goes down long enough, maybe we'll build it. If the region comes back up fast enough, maybe we just wait, right? So workload by workload scenario, but your most critical workloads will probably need at least a warm standby, and so that will dictate how much infrastructure you have to build out at a minimum depending on what your most critical workload is. All right. So multi-region active. So obviously this is your quickest time and your lowest RPO and RTO, right? Your data is actively replicating, you're taking load in both regions. You'll most likely need asynchronous data, right, between your databases, but everything is built there, everything is taking load. You might be using some kind of round robin, or maybe it's latency based or geo based on how you're routing that traffic. But another thing to keep in mind though is while you're taking, load split out across two regions, you still have to have scaling policies available that if that region goes down and you stop sending traffic to one region or the other, can the other region scale to take the full load, right? So is my auto scaling group large enough to take the full load, right? Am I being restricted? Or if it is, right, am I monitoring that to make sure that if we start to hit those peak demands, right, we don't want to start getting denial of service because our auto scaling policy will only let us go 25% above normal operating, right? And we had an event, that side went down, and now we've got to take 50% more, 100% more, 200% more. So keep those things in mind as you're really building these strategies. I know David asked this earlier, but is anybody actively doing active? How about warm standby? Is anybody doing warm standby? How many customers, how many of y'all have plans to move to at least a Pilot Light or a warm standby in the next year? A couple? All right, so a few things, right? A few things. For reliability and high availability, use a multi-availability zone architecture as your first step, right? You have to have highly available architectures so that you can meet your current demands. And then as you meet those demands, then you can start looking at, what is my backup strategy now and what is my backup strategy in the future? Multi-region active-active architecture helps limit the scope of impact in the case of major adverse events, right? So if the West Coast goes down, if you have your workloads in East, you're able to recover, you're able to keep doing that, right? But what are my requirements, right? What are my business critical applications, and what is the cost of downtime versus what is the cost to run the infrastructure to be able to recover, right? AWS does provide replication solutions for data such as Amazon DynamoDB global tables, our RDS cross-region read replicas, our S3 cross-region replication, et cetera. So use the services we have available to you. You can build your own, build EC2, build a cluster database, do the replication across either a transit gateway or something like that, right? But we do have services available to help with those. And last, you have to test your multi-region strategy, right? If you do not test, you may not pass the exam, right, when it comes time to, I have my infrastructure built out, but we never actually tested that it could take load. We never tested that the EC2 instances were able to talk to the database, right, or that we were able to fail over the database from one region to another, right? So test, test, test. You have to test. So where do we go from here, right? So reach out to your solutions architects, right, your account team. Schedule a well-architected review, right? David talked about we have our new sustainability pillar, right? So if that's something you're interested in, right, talk to your account teams. Get a call set up with them. If you want to know more about GovCloud, multi-region, those kinds of things, David and I are here. We're more than happy to entertain those, right? Afterwards, we'll be out in the back answering any questions you may have. But, let us help you figure out where improvements can be made, right? Whether that's efficiency, right? Lowering your cost, lowering your workload, helping be more highly available. And then what is that disaster recovery, that backup strategy? How do we get that data out of one region to the other? All right. So with AWS GovCloud US, you are able to build resilient and reliable multi-region environments that can accommodate your needs for disaster recovery and business continuity. Using the compliant framework for federal and DoD workloads in AWS GovCloud US, you have a roadmap to building a secure solution based on AWS best practices with a jumpstart on infrastructure as code. And so like I said earlier, if you have questions on this, set up a well-architected review, engage your account teams, and we'd be happy to meet with you. We do have a couple of resources available. We have a couple of QR codes if you want to take them. The first one is our reliability pillar, right, which is where most of this is derived from, right? And we also have our compliant framework for federal and DoD workloads in GovCloud US. There's a QR code there as well, along with the link. We also have our skill builder and our AWS certifications. If anybody's interested in that. And so thank you very much. Thank you for your time. If anybody wants to get a picture of our emails, I'm more than happy to email us. I'll leave that up for a second.